Russia gambled big on Ukraine and lost. But could the nation be on the brink of falling apart? The problems facing Russia today are significant and numerous, and even if the war were to end today, the nation would be in the weakest position it's been in since the fall of the Soviet Union, maybe even worse. Russia's most imminent problems are on the battlefield. After the launch of the Ukrainian fall counteroffensive, Russia's position in Ukraine is becoming increasingly difficult. The offensive was at first believed to be a flash in the pan by Ukrainian armed forces, with most of the world still believing Russia was simply too big and too capable of a military for the plucky Ukrainian forces to seriously threaten with overwhelming defeat. However, the initial gains in the northeast of the country soon turned into an outright rout of Russian forces. Ukraine cut off critical lines of communication running from Russia itself in the north to key positions in the center and northeastern occupied territories. The battle for Lyman sealed the fate of Russian forces in the occupied north. Here, Ukraine went up against the vaunted First Guards tank army, Russia's most elite armor formation. It was equipped with some of the best equipment that Russia could muster, and was originally meant to be the tip of the spear of an attack straight into NATO's best defenses. In an alternate scenario where NATO invaded Russia, the First Guards tank army would be held in reserve, counterattacking straight into any NATO breakthrough. The First Guards weren't just the best Russia had left, they were the best even before the war started, period. And Ukraine delivered such a stunning defeat that a significant portion of its equipment was abandoned, the tankers and gunners of the First Guards fleeing for their lives. The 144th Guards Motor Rifle Division, formed specifically to provide infantry support for the First Guards, was delivered an equally stunning defeat. Any Russian military blogger or Western Russian supporter still claiming that Russia was simply holding its best in reserve was permanently shut up. There simply is no better than the First Guards. The counteroffensive had failed to make significant gains in the south, which had originally believed to have been Ukraine's main objective. The ruse worked so well that Russia repositioned multiple battalion tactical groups to the south, leaving up its northern flank for exploitation. Here, Ukraine faced significant and overwhelming resistance, yet against all odds found victory with the liberation of Kherson. The city had been the only regional capital taken by Russian forces, and its liberation was a crushing blow to Russian morale. With the Ukrainian flag flying once more in Kherson, even the most hardline Russian supporters had begun to voice considerable concern over the state of their armed forces and the fate of the war. But Ukraine didn't achieve these victories in a vacuum, and this is where Russia faced its most significant problem in Ukraine. Since the start of the war, tens of billions of dollars of military aid have flown into Ukraine, with an equal amount of civilian aid to help keep Kyiv's government afloat. When it became clear that a quick military victory wasn't possible, Russia had planned on simply waiting out Kyiv's inevitable financial collapse, exploiting the resulting chaos and lack of government support to erode public support for the Kyiv government. However, that collapse never came, as the West kept Kyiv and continues to keep it afloat with billions of dollars of financial aid. If this wasn't bad enough, advanced Western equipment is the most dangerous threat to Russian forces today. In order to attempt to stop or at least slow the rate of direct military support, Russia attempted to play the nuclear trump card. Vladimir Putin has played a game of nuclear brinksmanship since it became clear in late summer that his forces had failed and the Russian military was having its initial momentum reversed. To his credit, it's been effective, just not quite effective enough. The threat of nuclear weapons has been heavily hinted at by Vladimir Putin, with him repeatedly stating that no option was off the table. Though he's not specifically stated he would use nuclear weapons, even when asked directly, he's chosen to speak ambiguously enough to leave the specter of nuclear warfare alive and well in the minds of the West. Naturally, Western observers were horrified at the thought of nukes dropping inside Ukraine, and even more so of what they'd inevitably mean when the West retaliated against Russia for their use. For the first time since the Cold War, the world was once more staring down the barrel of global nuclear warfare. But Vladimir wasn't just talking tough, he was talking directly to you, the supporters of Ukraine all around the world, because he wanted to scare you enough to question either your government's or the West's continued support of Ukraine. Since Vladimir's nuclear threats, global media has been rampant with one word: escalation. Any discussion about sending more weapons to Ukraine, and even Ukraine's brilliant tactical and strategic victories both in and outside Russia, has been accompanied by a healthy amount of warnings about escalation. The United States itself has refused to give Ukraine the war-winning weapons it needs out of fears of escalating Russia's response. This is all nonsense. Russia cannot escalate this war any further. It escalated it when it sent its best units, held in reserve in case of NATO provocation, into Ukraine. It escalated when it dipped into its reserves of precision weapons, also held in reserve in case of war with NATO, in order to try to turn the tide in Ukraine. and it escalated when it instituted the draft of 300,000 conscripts to try to reverse its steady defeat. Russia is out of options because nuclear weapons were never on the table. The use of nuclear weapons would be national suicide for Russia. It would seal Russia's fate as a pariah terrorist state for decades to come, turning away even its most ardent supporters amongst the Chinese Communist Party, its only influential friends it has left on the world stage. Even opportunistic nations such as India, who turn away from the international norms and have exploited cheap Russian energy for their own gain, would find their relationship with Russia too cancerous to continue, and the flow of weapons into Ukraine would only increase, not decrease, as the West is galvanized to truly destroy Russia by forcing it into military and economic suicide inside Ukraine, eliminating it forever as a threat to the world order. NATO would never have to fire a shot in retaliation, though they almost certainly would do that as well, unleashing conventional strikes against Russian forces from the air. Yet, Vladimir keeps rattling the nuclear saber because it scares Westerners, and the tactic has worked. The US is not providing Ukraine the ATACMS long-range land attack missile it's requested since the start of the war, out of fear of escalation. Yet without this weapon, Ukraine is forced to try to stop attacks on its infrastructure by Russian long-range bombers with guerrilla attacks against airfields deep inside Russia itself. Every time Western media says the word escalation, it undermines Ukraine's ability to defend its own people, and it plays straight into Vladimir Putin's hands. Yet, as the war drags on, the flow of weapons into Ukraine increases, not decreases. The US just announced it'd be sending the Patriot air defense system into Ukraine, and has tacitly approved deep strikes into Russian territory after successful attacks against airfields deep inside Russia by Ukraine. Until then, the US publicly refused to support such an act. Now, with US approval, could come US intelligence and targeting data, dramatically increasing the effectiveness of future attacks. Russia has responded to its battlefield defeats by attempting to launch a strategic bombing campaign against Ukraine using long-range air-to-ground missiles, ballistic missiles, and even suicide drones. But this tactic has almost no chance of working. First, strategic bombing alone has failed to lead to direct military victory in any conflict since the advent of flight. Even in World War II, a post-war survey conducted by the US military revealed that strategic bombing of German industry only had brief effects on its ability to continue supporting the war. Factories were either quickly rebuilt or repaired, and it was only the severing of supply lines and direct ground action that produced long-lasting, severe industrial impairment. Likewise, the bombing of Japan's industry hampered but did not stop Japan's ability to wage war, and would have never ended the conflict on its own. In the Vietnam War, the United States had effectively run out of targets to bomb after only a few years of fighting. Any target with any industrial or economic value had already been demolished, sometimes twice or even 3 times over, and yet the war would famously end with peace between the US and the North, the pullout of US forces, and victory by the North over the South, whose own industry had been largely intact. Russia's current terror campaign is doomed to failure as it faces 2 significant problems. The first has to do with what the campaign is supposed to do. Russia is targeting Ukraine's power grid and civilian infrastructure with a healthy smattering of random civilian targets as well. The purpose is to dismantle Ukraine's power grid, therefore plunging the nation into darkness in the midst of a freezing winter. To its credit, Russia has achieved many of its objectives in this regard, with some reports stating that as much as 40% of Ukraine's power grid is either offline or severely damaged. Considering that Russia still has the Soviet-era plans showing the entire Ukrainian power grid, this is at least one target they should have been able to hit. The attacks have left millions without power and forced rolling blackouts across the country in order to ease the burden on the grid itself. Without a doubt, this terror campaign will, in fact, cost Ukraine dearly, with the death of thousands to the increasing cold and undermining Ukrainian morale. Yet, Ukraine's morale remains largely intact, with President Zelensky famously replying, "Read my lips, without gas or without you, without you, without light or without you, without you, without water or without you, without you, without food or without you, without you." Easy to see why the man and Ukraine's fighting spirit was Time magazine's Man of the Year. Zelensky's words are brave and likely to go down in the annals of history to be quoted for centuries, along other such gems as, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." But they're more than that, because as history has shown time and again, breaking the will of the people to resist is incredibly difficult to do, and populations are willing to bear incredible hardships to see victory through. Even with the majority of its territory under threat or directly occupied, Germany refused to surrender in World War II, and civilians were being rounded up to form territorial defense units up until the moment the Soviets erected their flag over the German parliamentary building. In 1944, as Japan was facing obvious defeat and its forces were routed or destroyed across the South Pacific, only 10% of the Japanese people believed victory was impossible. By 1945, with near daily attacks against the home islands by American bombers, that number had risen to 19%. In June of that same year, after 2 atomic bombings and nearly every major population center having been firebombed into oblivion, food rations cut down to less than half, over 50% of the Japanese people still believed they could win the war. Through the lens of history and strategic bombing campaigns far more brutal and thorough than anything Russia has accomplished in Ukraine, it's clear that Ukraine's fighting spirit is exceedingly unlikely to break just because life has become tough for its population. But this is only part of Russia's problem. The second major problem with Russia's terror bombing campaign has to do with what the campaign is not doing. Though strategic bombing has had limited effects throughout history on industrial capability to support an ongoing war, it is not without value. During World War II, U.S. targeting of Japanese infrastructure did have an appreciable effect on its war economy. But as usual, the costs were largely transferred over to the civilian sector. Still, Russia's major problem with its current campaign is that it's not even capable of targeting Ukraine's ability to resupply its forces because Ukrainian resupply is coming from outside the country. Russia can bomb civilians all at once, but at the end of the day, those same angry civilians are still being equipped by a flow of arms produced in the West, something that Russia can do nothing about. Russia can't hit NATO factories, nor can it even inflict any form of economic harm to them via sanctions or strategic blockading of resources. Simply doesn't have the global political capital that the US and its Western allies have. And despite repeated warnings that Russia would bomb NATO convoys crossing into Ukraine full of weapons and ammo, Russia has yet to even attempt that fact, probably because US President Biden made it clear at the start of the war that any such attack would constitute an attack on NATO itself. Even if it wanted to, though, Russia simply doesn't have the targeting or strike capability to even reach these targets in Ukraine's west. Unlike Russia, the United States and its Western allies, however, do have a lot of political capital, and they have exerted that capital to inflict crippling sanctions on Russia. This, too, is another critical issue facing Russia today. Russia now faces the worst sanctions ever imposed on a nation in peacetime, and the effects are staggering. At first, Russia was able to publicly shrug off the effects of sanctions thanks to a healthy war chest of around $600 billion that it had saved up for exactly this kind of contingency. However, half of that war chest was frozen in Western bank accounts at the start of the war, something Russia never dreamed would happen, as it had severely underestimated the West's willingness to punish Russia for war against its former republic. However, with hundreds of billions still in reserve, Russia was able to keep the ruble afloat, albeit via extreme measures, and the Russian economy relatively stable. That money is now running out. The Russian economy is feeling the pinch. Its own central bank estimates a contraction of 7.1% in the final quarter of 2022, with little prospect of contraction reversing in 23. Revenues from the sale of energy resources, which Russia relies on heavily, were only moderately impacted by Western sanctions until a cap on oil prices to non-Western nations was implemented on December 5th. This price cap directly affects non-Western consumers who rely on Western infrastructure or shipping to receive their oil, and caps Russian oil well below market prices. Subsequently, a complete ban on seaborne Russian oil by the EU delivered yet another body blow to Russia's all-important energy industry. This isn't the only blow to the Russian economy, however. Not only have hundreds of Western businesses left Russia altogether or severely curtailed operations, but the nation has faced global bans of imports of critically needed items for a modern economy to function. Few of these hit Russia quite as hard as Taiwan's sanctions on Russia directly preventing the country from purchasing semiconductors and other electronics, which had an immediate and direct impact on Russia's military as well as economy. While Russia can produce small amounts of modern equipment completely on its own, it's unable to replenish the thousands of weapons used up in nearly a year of fighting. Multiple Russian defense manufacturers have slowed or stopped operations completely. Most telling, however, might be reports from Russian military bloggers that in the recent fighting in Bakhmut, Russian forces are complaining of a shortage of artillery shells. For its part, the Department of Defense estimates that Russia still has enough inventory left to continue fighting through winter. With Ukraine already planning a major spring offensive, though, the fate of its military forces in the spring and summer to come remains questionable. Today, Russia's in an incredibly tenuous position. Another round of drafts is desperately needed to replenish manpower inside Ukraine, violating the traditional deal between the corrupt Russian government and its population. For decades, a silent agreement between the Kremlin and the population stood as such: you don't complain about corruption and we don't mess with your lives. As long as the standard of living continued to slowly increase, the Russian people were willing to tolerate Vladimir and his cronies. But that deal is being violated as drafts force more Russians into an increasingly unpopular war, and the spread via social media of Russian defeats and the terrible conditions its forces are forced to endure is only going to erode support further, pulling apart the fabric of Russian society. Many non-ethnic Russians inside Russia itself might find themselves wondering why they continue to send their young and a disturbing amount of very old men to fight in the Kremlin's war. Inside Ukraine, the taking of Kherson has put Russian positions in Crimea in serious jeopardy. Some American military observers estimate that Ukraine will be able to take Crimea back by the end of next summer, and already long-range artillery has begun to strike at Russian air bases inside the peninsula. In the east, Ukrainian forces are poised to enter separatist territory, where a significant portion of the population may not want to rejoin Ukraine and still support Russia. Here, Russia may finally be able to pry one single victory away in this war. Though with Russia using separatists as human cannon fodder, it remains unknown how the populations will end up swaying. Now go check out why Iran is helping Russia, or click this other video instead.